Now I'm going to address democratic socialism as it relates to the Old Testament and the New Testament. A component of socialism was instituted in the Bible in the Old Testament in the law that was given by God through Moses for the Israelites. Those who identify themselves as Christian conservatives should already know these irrefutable scriptural facts, but many of them are probably following the lie that has been taught by so-called preachers concerning the tithe. For those who did not know, a component of socialism is clearly evident in the Old Testament law, as the Israelites were commanded to tithe their produce of the land and livestock, so the Levites, strangers, the fatherless, and widows could eat, as commanded by God in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 28 and 29, which reads as follows. At the end of 3 years, thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and shalt lay it up within thy gates. And the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hand which thou doest. Here, a component of socialism is commanded by God for the Israelites, and as such, theocratic socialism is clearly evident here in the command concerning the Israelites and their tithes. God intended for the Levites, strangers, fatherless, and widows to eat, and the food they would eat were the tithes of the produce of the land and the livestock that was given by the Israelites as a result of God's command. The prophet Malachi addressed the issue of the tithe in Malachi chapter 3, verse 10, which reads as follows. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. The word meat in Malachi chapter 3, verse 10 is the word teref in the Hebrew, which is defined as food. And the Israelites were told to bring all the tithes of the produce of the land and livestock into the storehouse, so there will be food in God's house. The Israelites were operating under the law given to them by God through Moses, as the tithe was a food program designed by God to feed the Levites, strangers to the land, the fatherless, and widows, as stated in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 28 and 29. The Israelites had to tithe their produce of the land and livestock as commanded by God in Leviticus chapter 27, verses 30 through 32, which reads as follows. And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord. And if a man will at all redeem aught of his tithes, he shall add thereto the 5th part thereof. And concerning the tithe of the herd or of the flock, even of whatsoever passeth under the rod, the 10th shall be holy unto the Lord. As I stated, these commands were given by God through Moses for Israel, as stated in Leviticus chapter 27, verse 34, which reads as follows. These are the commandments which the Lord commanded Moses for the children of Israel in Mount Sinai. Under the tithe, it was about the common good, as the Israelites would contribute a tithe or 10% of their produce of the land and the livestock in order to feed the Levites, strangers to the land, the fatherless, and widows, as stated in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 28 and 29. God ordained this component of socialism in the theocratic government ordained for the Israelites. In the New Testament, the tithe food program was still being utilized during the time of Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ endorses the tithe component of socialism in Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, which reads as follows: "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone." Jesus Christ endorses the tithe component of socialism in Luke chapter 11, verse 42, which reads as follows: "But woe unto you, Pharisees, for ye tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs, and pass over judgment and the love of God. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone." In Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, and Luke chapter 11, verse 42, Jesus Christ was talking to the scribes and Pharisees who were operating under the law that required the Israelites to tithe their produce of the land and their livestock to the Levites and Levite priests, as commanded by God in Exodus chapter 23, verse 19, Leviticus chapter 27, verses 30 through 34, Numbers chapter 18, verse 12, Numbers chapter 18, verses 20 through 28, and Deuteronomy chapter 26. The Levites and Levite priests were to offer a tithe or tenth of the tithes that they received from the Israelites to the Lord. The high priest would offer the Lord's portion as a burnt offering, as stated in Numbers chapter 18, verses 25 and 26, which reads as follows: "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Thus speak unto the Levites, and say unto them, When ye take of the children of Israel the tithes which I have given you from them for your inheritance, then ye shall offer up a heave offering of it for the Lord, even a tenth part of the tithe." The scribes and Pharisees were operating under the law where God ordained this component of socialism for the Israelites. In Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, what is mint, anise, and cumin? It is produce of the land. This verse proves that the scribes and Pharisees were operating under the law given by God through Moses for the Israelites. We see the same thing in Luke chapter 11, verse 42. What is mint, rue, and all manner of herbs? It is produce of the land. This verse coincides with Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, and proves that the scribes and Pharisees were operating under the law given by God through Moses for the Israelites. The scribes and Pharisees operated under the commands of God that were given to the Israelites, Levites, and Levite priests, which required them to tithe the produce of the land and the livestock. The Israelites were commanded by God to tithe their produce of the land and livestock to the Levites and Levite priests. And the Levites and Levite priests were commanded by God to offer a tithe, or in other words, a tenth of that tithe, to the Lord as the Lord's portion. The scribes and Pharisees operated under the commands of God that were given to the Israelites by God through Moses for this component of socialism, which required them to tithe the produce of the land and the livestock so there would be food in God's house to feed the Levites, strangers to the land, the fatherless, and widows. God commanded this component of socialism in the Old Testament, and Jesus Christ confirmed God's command for this component of socialism in the New Testament. Jesus Christ stated that the scribes and Pharisees should be tithing their produce of the land and livestock when he stated in Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, and Luke chapter 11, verse 42, "These ought ye to have done." This confirms Jesus' ideological mindset concerning the incorporation of this component of socialism into the law. Jesus agreed wholeheartedly with the tithe food program, which ensured that Levites, the fatherless, widows, and even strangers in the land were fed.